May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Across America, church bells rang and crowds filled the streets in celebration. In prisoner of war camps from Texas to New York, German soldiers prepared for repatriation to their defeated homeland. But in a small facility at Camp Swift, Texas, something unprecedented was happening. When American commanders announced to a group of German women prisoners that they were free to return home, 8 of them did the unthinkable. They begged to stay. The moment that changed everything had happened 3 months earlier in a mess hall that smelled of chocolate and impossibility. Brunhilde Richter, known to everyone as Hilda, stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, staring at what the Americans called depression cake. The rich brown squares sat cooling on metal trays, their surface glistening with a thin chocolate glaze. Her hands trembled as she gripped the doorframe. This was supposed to be poverty food. This was what Americans baked when they had nothing. She had been taught that America was weak, that its people were soft and starving under the weight of their own decadence. Yet here in this prison camp kitchen, surrounded by her fellow captives, she was looking at more chocolate in one place than she had seen in the last 3 years of war combined. Mrs. Enid Patterson, the kitchen supervisor, noticed Hilda's expression and smiled with the kind of warmth that still confused the German women after months of captivity. "Come here, honey," she said in her thick Texas drawl. "You need to taste this while it's still warm." Hilda approached slowly, aware that Edeltraud Koch and Sieglinde Zimmermann were watching from their positions at the washing station. They had all learned to be cautious about American kindness. It always seemed to come with some hidden price, some trick they had not yet discovered. But there was no trick in the slice Mrs. Patterson cut and placed on a small plate. Just a simple square of dark cake that released a smell so intoxicating that Hilda felt tears spring to her eyes before she could stop them. In Dresden, before the firebombing, her mother had made a birthday cake once with a tiny amount of ersatz chocolate. It had tasted like chalk and disappointment. This smelled like every childhood dream of sweetness she had ever abandoned. "Go on," Mrs. Patterson urged. "It ain't fancy, but it'll do." Hilda lifted the fork with a hand that had grown steadier over her months of kitchen work. The cake was still warm, yielding easily to the pressure. She brought it to her mouth and tasted it, and in that moment, everything she had been told about America crumbled like the tender crumb on her tongue. It was rich, it was sweet. It was made with real chocolate and real sugar, ingredients that had become fairy tales in Germany. And the Americans called this depression food. Food for when times were hard, food for when they had nothing. Before we discover how a simple chocolate cake convinced 8 German women to choose captivity over freedom, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 6 months earlier, in November of 1944, when the first group of German women prisoners arrived at Camp Swift. The facility, located in the scrubland outside Bastrop, Texas, had been hastily adapted to house female prisoners of war. Unlike the larger camps that held thousands of German and Italian men, this compound was designed for fewer than 70 women. They had been captured during the final Allied push through France and Belgium, serving the Wehrmacht as radio operators, nurses, administrative clerks, and communications specialists. Hilda Richter stepped off the transport truck into the blazing Texas sun and felt the heat hit her like a physical blow. At 24 years old, she had survived the bombing of Dresden, the chaos of military retreat, and the uncertainty of capture. But nothing had prepared her for Texas in November, where the temperature still climbed into the 80s, while back home, her fellow Germans were already shivering through another winter without adequate fuel. She wore the remnants of her gray auxiliary uniform, now stained and worn from weeks of travel. Beside her, Edeltraud Koch maintained the rigid posture of military discipline despite obvious exhaustion. At 31, Edeltraud was one of the older women in their group, a former administrative officer who had kept meticulous records for a supply division. Her face showed no emotion as American guards directed them toward the processing building, but Hilda noticed how her hands gripped her small canvas bag with white-knuckled intensity. Sieglinde Zimmermann, just 19 years old, looked around with wide, frightened eyes. She had been a radio operator, one of the youngest in her unit, and had been captured during a communications outpost evacuation. She stayed close to Gertrude Lehman, a 27-year-old nurse who had seen things during the war that had left permanent shadows in her expression. The four women had formed an unlikely alliance during their journey to America, bound together by shared fear and uncertainty about what awaited them. Captain Mildred Sutherland, the American officer assigned to oversee the facility, watched the new arrivals with careful assessment. At 42 years old, she had spent most of her military career in administrative positions, never imagining she would be responsible for housing enemy women on American soil. She had read their files, knew their service records, and understood that these were not hardened soldiers, but young women who had been swept up in their nation's war machine. Still, she maintained professional distance as she addressed them through an interpreter. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention," she told them in clear, measured tones. "You will be provided housing, food, and medical care. You will follow camp rules and maintain order. Your conduct will determine your privileges." Hilda listened to the translation and heard what was not being said. They were enemies on American soil. They should expect harsh treatment, minimal rations, and the kind of brutality that German propaganda had promised them American captors would deliver. She braced herself for degradation and suffering. Instead, they were led to barracks that, while simple, were clean and weatherproof. Each woman was issued bedding, toiletries, and a change of clothing. But it was the evening meal that first shattered their expectations. The mess hall that first evening was a moment of profound disorientation for every German woman who entered it. They filed in with the mechanical precision of military training, their faces carefully blank, their expectations set for watery soup and a crust of bread. What they found instead was a meal that seemed impossible. There was meat, actual meat, not the ersatz products or the tiny ration portions they had grown accustomed to in Germany, but real beef in a rich gravy. There were potatoes, mashed and buttered. There were green beans, soft white bread, and even small portions of canned fruit for dessert. The American guards served the food with casual indifference, as if this abundance was completely ordinary. Hilda stood in line holding her metal tray, watching the server pile food onto it with generous scoops. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. This was more food than she had seen in a single meal in over 2 years. And this was for prisoners, for enemies, for women who had served the regime that America was fighting to destroy. She carried her tray to a long table where Edeltraud, Sieglind, and Gertrude had already sat down. None of them had touched their food yet. They all stared at their trays with the same expression of disbelief and suspicion. "It must be poisoned," Sieglinde whispered in German. "Why else would they give us so much?" Gertrude, who had medical training, examined her food carefully. "I see no signs of tampering," she said quietly. "But I agree this makes no sense. We were told Americans were starving, that their country was weak and resource poor." Edeltraud cut a small piece of the meat and studied it. "This is real beef," she said, her voice tight with confusion. "Not horse meat, not substitute. Real beef." Around them, other German women were having similar quiet conversations, their voices a mixture of German and broken English. Some had begun to eat, driven by hunger that overrode suspicion. Others waited, watching to see if those first brave souls would suffer any ill effects. Hilda watched Private Harlan Dupree, a young guard from Georgia, as he moved through the mess hall. He was perhaps 21 or 22, with a kind of open, friendly face that seemed incapable of cruelty. He noticed their hesitation and approached their table. "Everything all right, ladies?" he asked, his southern accent thick and warm. The women stared at him without responding. He tried again, speaking slower. "Food okay? You need anything else?" Hilda found her voice, speaking in the careful English she had learned in school years ago. "Why do you give us this much food? We are prisoners." Private Dupree looked genuinely confused by the question. "Well, ma'am, That's just a regular dinner portion. Can't have y'all going hungry. That ain't right, prisoner or not." He said it with such simple sincerity that Hilda felt something crack in her carefully maintained composure. She had been prepared for cruelty, for deprivation, for punishment. She had not been prepared for casual kindness from a man who should have been her enemy. She picked up her fork and took a small bite of the mashed potatoes. They were real, buttery, seasoned with salt and pepper. They tasted like abundance in a world she had believed was starving. The first 2 weeks at Camp Swift passed in a fog of confusion and careful observation. The German women maintained their military discipline, rising at the same time each morning, keeping their barracks spotless, and speaking to their American captors only when necessary. They could not reconcile what they were experiencing with everything they had been taught about their enemy. The propaganda had been clear and consistent. Americans were weak, decadent people who would crumble under the pressure of total war. Their soldiers were undisciplined civilians playing at military service. Their country was fractured by racial tensions and economic collapse. Most importantly, they were cruel victors who would show no mercy to captured enemies. Yet every day brought new evidence that contradicted these teachings. The food remained abundant. The barracks stayed heated as December approached. The American guards treated them with a casual courtesy that bordered on friendliness. It was profoundly disorienting. Sieglinde Zimmermann struggled most visibly with the adjustment. At 19, she was the youngest in their group, and the weight of captivity pressed heavily on her slight frame. She developed a persistent cough in early December, the kind of deep, rattling sound that worried Gertrude's trained medical ear. The camp had a small infirmary, but Sieglinde refused to go, convinced that showing weakness would result in punishment, or worse. "She's burning with fever," Gertrude told Hilda one cold morning as they prepared for breakfast. "She needs proper care, but she won't listen to me. She thinks they'll experiment on her like she's heard they do to prisoners." That afternoon, Private Harlan Dupree noticed Sieglinde's condition during his rounds. The young woman was sitting outside the barracks despite the cold, trying to catch her breath between coughing fits. Her face was flushed with fever, and she shivered violently in her issued coat. Dupree approached slowly, the way someone might approach a frightened animal. He had grown up with 3 younger sisters back in Georgia and recognized genuine illness when he saw it. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you need to see the doctor." Sieglinde shrank back against the barracks wall, her blue eyes wide with fear. She shook her head violently, unable to speak through another coughing fit. Dupree held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I ain't gonna force you, but you're mighty sick. At least let me bring you something warm to drink." He disappeared before she could protest and returned 20 minutes later with a thick wool blanket draped over his arm and a steaming cup in his hands. "Here," he said, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders with the same gentle care he would have shown his own sisters. "This here's tea with honey and lemon. My grandmother swore by it for chest colds." Sieglinde stared at him, tears beginning to stream down her fevered face. She had been taught that American soldiers were monsters. Yet here was this young man, barely older than her own brother, who had died at Stalingrad, showing her the kind of tenderness she had not experienced since leaving home. She accepted the tea with trembling hands and whispered in broken English, "Thank you." Dupree smiled. "You're welcome, ma'am. You drink that up and get yourself warm. And if that cough don't improve by tomorrow, you let someone know, all right?" December brought the first significant change in the women's daily routine. Captain Sutherland announced that volunteers would be needed to assist in the camp kitchen. The regular kitchen staff was short-handed due to holiday leave schedules, and the captain believed that giving the prisoners meaningful work would improve morale and reduce the tensions that came with idle captivity. Hilda volunteered immediately, as did Edeltraud and Gertrude. They had grown weary of the endless empty hours, the constant internal conflict between gratitude for their treatment and shame at feeling grateful toward their captors. Work, they reasoned, would provide distraction and purpose. They reported to the kitchen on a cold Monday morning in mid-December and met Mrs. Enid Patterson for the first time. She was a woman in her late 50s, round-faced and generous in both figure and spirit. She had worked in the Camp Swift kitchens since the facility opened, feeding thousands of soldiers and now, unexpectedly, enemy prisoners. "Well now," she said, looking over her new assistants with a practiced eye. "Y'all know how to cook?" Hilda nodded. "In Germany, before the war, I helped my mother in the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly. "Then we'll get along just fine. Come on, let me show you how we do things here." What followed was an education that shook the foundations of everything the German women believed about American poverty and weakness. The kitchen was vast, equipped with industrial stoves, massive refrigerators, and storage rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly. Mrs. Patterson led them through the facilities, explaining procedures and safety protocols, but it was the abundance that left them speechless. The storage rooms contained flour in quantities they had not seen since before the war began. There were barrels of sugar, crates of canned vegetables, and an entire cold room dedicated to meat storage. The American military fed its people with a level of abundance that seemed almost obscene to women who had watched their own nation slowly starve. Mrs. Patterson noticed their stunned expressions as they stood in the storage room. "I know it seems like a lot," she said kindly, "but we got a whole camp to feed. Got to make sure everyone eats proper." Edeltraud, who had managed supply records for the Wehrmacht, could not contain her professional curiosity. "How do you have so much? Germany has been rationing for years. Even before the war, we never had this much in our military kitchens." Mrs. Patterson considered the question carefully. "Well, honey, I suppose America's been blessed with good farmland and good people working it. Even with rationing, we manage pretty well. Though I'll tell you, during the Depression, things were mighty different. We learned to make do with a lot less back then." The mention of the Depression captured Hilda's attention. She had heard about American economic collapse in the 30s, had been taught that it proved the weakness of capitalist systems. "You had no food during the Depression?" she asked carefully. Mrs. Patterson laughed. "Oh, we had food, just not near the variety or amount we got now." Mrs. Patterson proved to be a patient teacher with a genuine gift for making her new assistants feel valued rather than merely tolerated. She assigned them tasks that matched their skill levels, praising good work and correcting mistakes with gentle humor. Within days, Hilda found herself looking forward to kitchen duty with an eagerness that both surprised and troubled her. The work itself was straightforward. They prepared vegetables, measured ingredients, cleaned equipment, and learned the rhythms of feeding hundreds of people on a military schedule. But the real education came through the countless small conversations that happened naturally during the long hours of food preparation. One morning, while showing Hilda how to prepare biscuit dough, Mrs. Patterson mentioned the rationing system that had been implemented across America since the war began. "We got ration books for sugar, butter, meat, coffee, and such," she explained, working the dough with practiced efficiency. "Each family gets so many points per week. You gotta plan careful to make it all stretch." Hilda watched the generous amount of butter being incorporated into the dough and struggled to understand. "But you have so much here. How can you say you are rationed?" Mrs. Patterson paused in her work and looked at Hilda with genuine curiosity. "How much butter did your family get back in Germany, honey?" Before Hilda could answer, Edeltraud spoke up from across the kitchen where she was chopping onions. "We had no butter," she said flatly. "Not real butter. We had margarine when we could get it. Sometimes lard, often nothing at all. The last real butter I tasted was in 1941. Mrs. Patterson's hands stilled in the dough. She looked between the German women with dawning understanding. "Y'all have been going without for that long?" Gertrude joined the conversation from her station at the stove. "We were told that America was suffering worse than Germany, that your people were starving while we were merely inconvenienced. We were told that rationing in America meant true starvation." An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. Mrs. Patterson resumed working the dough, but her movements had become more thoughtful, less automatic. "I reckon," she said slowly, "that both our countries have been telling their people what they needed to hear to keep the war effort going. But I can promise you, honey, ain't nobody starving in America." We're making do, eating less fancy than we might like, but we ain't going hungry." She cut the biscuit dough into rounds with swift, efficient movements. During the Depression now, that was different. Lost my husband in '33, had to feed 4 children on next to nothing. That's when I learned to cook with what I had instead of what I wished for. Those were hard years, truly hard, but we survived, we learned, and when better times came, we remembered those lessons. Hilda absorbed this information silently, filing it away with all the other contradictions she had encountered since arriving at Camp Swift. America had suffered economic collapse, had endured years of genuine hardship, yet had emerged strong enough to feed even its enemies with abundance. January brought frigid weather to Texas, though the German women found the cold laughable compared to the winters they had endured back home. Still, the American guards complained bitterly about the temperatures, which amused the prisoners in private conversations. "These soft Americans," Sieglinde had said one morning, "would not survive a single week of a German winter." But such comments had lost their edge of contempt. The women no longer spoke of Americans with the automatic disdain their propaganda training had instilled. Too much daily kindness had eroded that certainty. On January 12th, the kitchen buzzed with unusual activity. Mrs. Patterson had announced that they would be baking a birthday cake for Sergeant James Fletcher, one of the senior guards who was turning 30. The celebration would be modest, just cake and coffee during the evening meal, but Mrs. Patterson insisted on doing it properly. Hilda watched with fascination as Mrs. Patterson assembled ingredients for a proper American layer cake. Real eggs, real butter, real sugar, and genuine vanilla extract. The recipe called for quantities that would have fed a family for a week back in Dresden. Mrs. Patterson noticed Hilda's expression and smiled. "I know it seems extravagant, but birthdays are important. They remind us we're still human, still worth celebrating." Even during the Depression, Mama always made sure we had cake on birthdays, even if it was just a simple one-layer affair. Hilda helped measure flour and sugar, her hands moving automatically while her mind struggled with deeper questions. Why would these Americans celebrate so openly in front of their prisoners? Were they trying to demoralize the German women by flaunting their abundance? Or was this simply how they lived, with a casual generosity that included even their enemies in moments of joy? The cake emerged from the oven golden and fragrant, filling the kitchen with a smell that made Hilda's throat tight with memories of childhood celebrations that seemed impossibly distant. Mrs. Patterson prepared a simple buttercream frosting, spreading it with practiced skill between layers and across the top. That evening, the mess hall gathered for Sergeant Fletcher's celebration. The German women sat together at their usual tables, uncertain of their role in this American ritual. Captain Sutherland made a brief speech thanking Fletcher for his service, and several guards clapped him on the back with cheerful ribbing about getting old. Then, Mrs. Patterson emerged from the kitchen carrying the cake, candles flickering on top. The Americans sang their birthday song with boisterous enthusiasm. Hilda found herself watching Sergeant Fletcher's face as he blew out the candles. He looked genuinely happy, surrounded by comrades who clearly respected him. There was no cruelty in his expression, no hardness. Just a man grateful to be alive and celebrated. Mrs. Patterson began cutting generous slices of cake. To Hilda's shock, she did not stop with the American personnel. She continued cutting, and guards began distributing cake to the German prisoners as well. Private Dupree brought a slice to their table and set it down with his characteristic friendly smile. "Can't have a birthday party without sharing the cake," he said. "That wouldn't be right." Hilda stared at the slice before her. It was the same size as the portions given to the American guards, no smaller, no less generous. The birthday cake haunted Hilda's thoughts for days afterward. She had tasted American abundance, had experienced their casual generosity, but something about that cake unsettled her in ways she could not fully articulate. It represented everything she had been taught to despise about American decadence, yet it had been shared freely, given without expectation or ceremony, as if kindness to enemies was simply the natural order of things. Mrs. Patterson noticed Hilda's preoccupation and interpreted it correctly. "You're wondering how we can afford to bake fancy cakes while there's a war on, aren't you?" she asked one morning while they were preparing breakfast. Hilda nodded, grateful that Mrs. Patterson understood without requiring extensive explanation. Her English had improved dramatically, but complex thoughts still sometimes eluded her vocabulary. Mrs. Patterson wiped her hands on her apron and gestured for Hilda to follow her to the storage room. She pulled out a worn recipe box, the kind with handwritten cards stained from years of use. "Let me show you something, honey." She flipped through cards until she found what she wanted. "Here, this is what we call depression cake, also known as wacky cake or war cake." Hilda took the card and read the ingredients with growing confusion. Flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, salt, vinegar, vanilla, and water. "That's all? No eggs, no milk, no butter?" Mrs. Patterson smiled. "That's right. We invented this during the Depression when folks couldn't afford eggs and butter, or when those things just weren't available. Then, when war rationing started, it came back into fashion." She retrieved ingredients from the shelves with practiced efficiency. "We're making this today. I want you to see that even when Americans have to make do, we still find ways to make something sweet." The process was surprisingly simple. They mixed dry ingredients in one bowl, created wells for the wet ingredients, and combined everything directly in the baking pan. No elaborate techniques, no expensive mixer required, just basic ingredients transformed through simple chemistry into something that would become cake. While it baked, Mrs. Patterson explained the science behind it. The vinegar reacts with the baking soda to make it rise. The cocoa gives it flavor. The sugar makes it sweet. You don't need fancy ingredients to make something good, just knowledge and resourcefulness. When the cake emerged from the oven, dark and fragrant, Hilda felt her carefully constructed understanding of American weakness crumble further. This was poverty food. This was what Americans baked when they claimed to be suffering. Yet it contained real cocoa powder and real sugar, luxuries that had disappeared from German civilian life years ago. Mrs. Patterson prepared a simple chocolate glaze using cocoa, sugar, and water. She poured it over the still warm cake and let it set for a few minutes before cutting a corner piece and offering it to Hilda on a small plate. "Go on," she urged. "Tell me what you think." Hilda accepted the plate with trembling hands. Around her, Edeltraud and Gertrude had stopped their work to watch. This moment felt significant in ways none of them could fully explain. Hilda lifted the fork slowly, aware that Edeltraud, Gertrude, and even Sieglinde, who had come to help in the kitchen after recovering from her illness, were watching her intently. The depression cake looked humble compared to the elaborate birthday cake they had made for Sergeant Fletcher. No fancy frosting, no layers, just a simple square of dark chocolate cake with a thin glaze. She brought the fork to her mouth and tasted it. The cake was moist and tender, rich with chocolate flavor despite its simple ingredients. The sweetness bloomed across her tongue, real sugar and real cocoa, combining in a way that made her close her eyes involuntarily. It was delicious. Genuinely, undeniably delicious. And the Americans called this poverty food. Mrs. Patterson watched Hilda's reaction with gentle understanding. "It's good, isn't it? Simple, but good. That's the thing about American cooking, honey. We learned to make the best of what we had. Even during the hardest times, we found ways to celebrate, to make something sweet, to remember that life is worth living." Hilda set down her fork carefully, afraid that her hands were shaking too visibly. In Dresden, during the last year before she joined the Auxiliary Corps, her family had celebrated her brother's birthday with a cake made from sawdust mixed with a tiny amount of flour and artificial sweetener. They had pretended it was good, had sung and smiled, but it had tasted like desperation and defeat. This American Depression cake, this poverty food, made from basic ingredients, was richer and more genuine than anything she had eaten in Germany for years. The propaganda had been so thorough, so convincing, she had believed that Americans were weak, that their economy had collapsed beyond recovery, that their people suffered worse than Germans under the pressures of war. Yet here was the evidence that everything she had been told was a lie. Americans had endured economic hardship and had responded by becoming more resourceful, more innovative, more capable. They had taken scarcity and transformed it into opportunity to create new solutions. Edeltraud spoke quietly in German, her voice thick with emotion. If this is how they eat when they claim to be poor, what have we been fighting for? What were we told about American weakness? All lies. Gertrude joined them at the table, accepting a slice of cake from Mrs. Patterson. She tasted it and closed her eyes. My mother used to save for months to buy enough chocolate for Christmas cookies. Just a small amount, barely enough to flavor one batch. This cake has more chocolate than my entire family saw in a year. Sieglinde, still thin from her recent illness but recovering steadily thanks to the abundant food and proper medical care, voiced what they were all thinking. We were told Americans were our enemies because they were weak and decadent. But they are not weak. They are strong in ways we never imagined. And if we were wrong about their weakness, what else were we wrong about? The question hung in the kitchen air, mingling with the sweet smell of chocolate. Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening quietly while cleaning mixing bowls, spoke with careful gentleness. I reckon every country tells its people what it needs them to believe during wartime. But the truth has a way of coming out eventually. February brought a development that the German women had both longed for and dreaded. The International Red Cross had finally established reliable mail routes from occupied Germany, and letters began arriving at Camp Swift. Captain Sutherland distributed them during evening assembly, calling names and handing over thin envelopes that had traveled across an ocean and through military channels to reach this small compound in Texas. Hilda received 2 letters. The first was from her aunt in Hamburg, written in cramped handwriting on paper so thin it was nearly transparent. The second was from a former neighbor in Dresden, someone she had not heard from since before the firebombing. She carried both letters back to her bunk and sat alone, afraid to open them. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Some tore into their letters immediately, desperate for any news from home. Others, like Hild, approached them with visible dread, understanding that the news they contained would likely bring more pain than comfort. She opened her aunt's letter first. The words were carefully chosen, written with awareness that military censors would read them, but the reality beneath the careful language was devastating. Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly. Her aunt's building had survived, but most of the neighborhood was rubble. Food was scarce, available only through ration cards that provided barely enough to survive. Her aunt's husband had died during a bombing raid. Her 2 cousins were missing, possibly dead, possibly displaced, somewhere in the chaos of occupied Germany. The letter ended with a question that pierced Hilda's heart. When you return, will you bring food? We are so hungry here. The second letter was worse. Her Dresden neighbor wrote with brutal honesty about the firebombing that had destroyed their city. Hilda's family home no longer existed. The entire neighborhood had burned. The neighbor did not know what had happened to Hilda's parents or her younger sister. They had not been seen since the night of the bombing. They were presumed dead, though without bodies there was no certainty, just absence and silence. Hilda sat motionless, the letters trembling in her hands. While she had been eating abundant meals, sleeping in a warm barracks, and learning to bake chocolate cake with real cocoa and sugar, her family had been starving, burning, dying. The guilt was crushing, physical, making it hard to breathe. Across the barracks, Edeltraud was reading her own letters with tears streaming down her face. Sieglinde had collapsed onto her bunk, sobbing into her pillow. Gertrude sat rigid and silent, her face completely blank in the way of someone experiencing shock too profound for immediate emotional response. That night, 23 German women gathered in the common area, sharing news from home in quiet, devastated voices. The picture that emerged was one of complete destruction. Cities in ruins, families scattered or dead, Food scarce to the point of starvation, infrastructure collapsed, economy non-existent. Germany was not just defeated, it was destroyed, broken beyond anything they had imagined while isolated in American captivity. Hilda thought about the depression cake cooling in the kitchen, about the storage rooms full of flour and sugar, about the casual abundance that surrounded them daily. The letters from Germany had created a profound shift in the women's emotional state. The guilt of their relative comfort while their families suffered became almost unbearable. Many stopped eating full portions, pushing food around their plates, as if consuming American abundance was a betrayal of their starving relatives. Captain Sutherland noticed the change and called a meeting with Mrs. Patterson and the camp medical officer to discuss intervention strategies. But before they could implement any plans, news arrived that would shake the German women even more deeply than the letters from home. It came through newspapers first, then through official military briefings. As Allied forces advanced deeper into German territory, they were discovering concentration camps. The initial reports were met with disbelief, even among American soldiers who thought they had seen the worst of war. Then came the photographs. Captain Sutherland debated whether to allow the German prisoners access to this information, ultimately deciding that truth, however painful, was necessary. She made newspapers available in the common area, knowing that many of the women had learned enough English to read them. Hilda found the first newspaper on a Tuesday morning in late February. The headline was stark, the accompanying photograph grainy but clear enough. She stood frozen, reading words that her mind initially refused to accept. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. Places she had never heard of, existing in the same country she had proudly served. The article described systematic murder, starvation, medical experiments, and industrial-scale death. The numbers were incomprehensible. Thousands, tens of thousands. Eventually, the reports would speak of millions. Edeltraud found her there, staring at the newspaper with tears streaming down her face. "What is it?" she asked in German, then looked at the paper and fell silent. Other women gathered around, reading over shoulders, translating for those whose English was weaker. The common area filled with a heavy, terrible silence as they confronted what their country had done. "This cannot be real," Sieglinde whispered. "This is American propaganda. They are trying to break us." But Gertrude, who had medical training and understood the clinical details in the reports, shook her head slowly. "The medical descriptions are too accurate, the photographs too detailed. This is not propaganda. This is documentation." The women dispersed slowly, each retreating to process this information privately. Hilda returned to her bunk and lay down, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the Hitler Youth meetings she had attended, the speeches about German greatness and racial purity that had seemed so inspiring at the time. She thought about the casual anti-Semitic remarks that had peppered everyday conversation, the gradual disappearance of Jewish neighbors that everyone had pretended not to notice. She had believed she was serving her country's defense, protecting German culture and sovereignty. She had never questioned the ideology beneath the military operations. She had been so certain of Germany's righteousness, so convinced of the justice of their cause. Now she understood that while she was filing communications reports and maintaining radio equipment, her countrymen were committing atrocities beyond her darkest imagination. The revelation about the concentration camps fractured something fundamental in the German women's understanding of themselves and their nation. Some retreated into denial, insisting the reports were exaggerated or fabricated. Others, like Hilda, could not escape the weight of complicity. They had served the regime that committed these atrocities. Their ignorance did not absolve them. The American staff watched this crisis with mixed emotions. Some felt vindication, a grim satisfaction that the enemy was finally confronting the evil they had supported. Others, like Mrs. Patterson and Private Dupree, felt genuine compassion for women who were clearly devastated by these revelations. Captain Sutherland called a meeting with her senior staff to discuss how to handle the situation. "These women are experiencing a complete collapse of their worldview," she explained. "We need to provide structure and purpose, or we risk serious psychological deterioration. The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson suggested expanding the kitchen program, offering more intensive training in American cooking techniques and recipes. Give them something to do with their hands, she argued. Give them a way to be useful. Let them learn something that might help them build a future, whatever that future looks like. The program began in early March. Mrs. Patterson organized structured lessons, teaching not just recipes but the philosophy behind American cooking. She emphasized resourcefulness, adaptability, and the importance of hospitality. She showed them how to stretch ingredients, how to substitute when supplies ran short, how to create abundance from simplicity. Hilda threw herself into these lessons with desperate intensity. Cooking became both penance and purpose. Each recipe she mastered was a small act of becoming someone different from who she had been. She was no longer the naive girl who had believed German propaganda. She was learning to be someone who understood that kindness and generosity were not weaknesses but strengths. Mrs. Patterson taught them to make biscuits from scratch, explaining how Southern women had perfected the technique during harder times. She showed them how to prepare cornbread, beans, and simple stews that could feed families on limited budgets. She shared her mother's recipe for vinegar pie, a Depression-era dessert that created sweetness from basic pantry staples. But she kept returning to the Depression cake, making it again and again with different variations. Sometimes she added coffee to deepen the chocolate flavor. Sometimes she used different glazes or frostings. Each version was a lesson in creativity within constraints. You see, she told her students, this cake represents something important about America. When times got hard, we didn't give up on joy. We found new ways to celebrate. We adapted. Edeltraud, who had always been reserved and formal, began asking questions about American culture beyond just cooking. She wanted to understand how a country could survive economic depression and emerge stronger, how Americans balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility, how they maintained optimism in difficult circumstances. Gertrude found particular interest in the nutritional aspects of American cooking. Mrs. Patterson taught her about balanced meals, about ensuring adequate vitamins and minerals even with limited ingredients. This knowledge, Gertrude realized, could help rebuild Germany when she eventually returned. May 8, 1945, arrived with the news that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across America, church bells ringing, and crowds gathering in spontaneous parties. At Camp Swift, the atmosphere was more subdued, complicated by the presence of women whose nation had just been utterly defeated. The American Guard celebrated quietly, respectful of the complex emotions their prisoners must be experiencing. For the German women, the day brought no joy, only a profound sense of loss and uncertainty. The war was over. Germany was defeated, occupied, divided among victorious powers. Everything they had known, everything they had believed in, was finished. Captain Sutherland addressed the prisoners that evening, her tone formal but not unkind. The war in Europe has concluded. Repatriation procedures will begin soon. You will be returned to Germany once logistics are arranged and conditions allow. You should begin preparing for this transition. The words sent a wave of anxiety through the assembled women. Return to what? To destroyed cities and scattered families? To a country occupied by foreign powers and struggling with starvation? To communities that would view them as failures who had been captured and corrupted by the enemy? Hilda lay awake that night, her mind churning with impossible questions. In the 6 months since arriving at Camp Swift, she had changed in ways she could not fully articulate. She had learned English, learned to cook American food, learned that enemies could show kindness, and that her own side could commit unspeakable evil. She had discovered talents and interests she never knew she possessed. The prospect of returning to Germany felt less like homecoming and more like exile from the person she was becoming. Around her in the darkened barracks, she could hear other women crying softly, wrestling with the same fears and uncertainties. Edeltraud's voice cut through the darkness, speaking in German. "Does anyone actually want to go back?" The question hung in the air, unspoken truth finally given voice. Several women responded quietly, admitting their own reluctance to return to devastation and judgment. "But what choice do we have?" Gertrude asked. "We are prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires our repatriation. We have no legal right to remain in America." Sieglinde, who had become increasingly outspoken as she recovered her health and confidence, spoke with unexpected firmness. "Legal rights can change. Policies can be negotiated. The question is not what we are allowed to do, but what we want to do, what we are willing to fight for." The conversation continued late into the night, women sharing their fears and hopes in hushed tones. Some still felt pulled toward Germany despite everything, driven by loyalty to family or homeland. Others admitted they had found something in American captivity that they were reluctant to surrender. Over the following weeks, as repatriation procedures slowly organized, the women's kitchen work took on new meaning. They were no longer just learning recipes. They were deciding who they wanted to become and where they wanted to build their futures. Mrs. Patterson noticed the change in her students' attitudes. They asked more questions, practiced more diligently, and seemed to be memorizing recipes as if their lives depended on it. June 15th arrived with unusual tension throughout Camp Swift. Captain Sutherland had called a general assembly to announce official repatriation procedures. Transportation had been arranged for early July. The German women would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before final release to return to their homes or what remained of them. The 62 women gathered in the mess hall, the same room where they had experienced so many moments of transformation. Hilda sat between Edeltraud and Gertrude, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Over the past month, the four friends had talked endlessly about their options, their fears, their desperate wish that some alternative existed to returning to devastated Germany. Captain Sutherland stood before them, official documents in hand. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Hilda thought she detected something softer beneath the military bearing. "Ladies, I have received final orders regarding your repatriation. Transportation will be arranged for July 7th. You will board ships in Galveston bound for Bremen. From there, you will be processed and released to return to your homes." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "I want you to know that your conduct here has been exemplary. You have worked hard, learned quickly, and shown genuine character. I wish you all the best in rebuilding your lives." Before Captain Sutherland could continue, Hilda stood up slowly. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had practiced these words in English for days, refining them with Mrs. Patterson's help, but now her mouth felt dry with fear. "Captain Sutherland, may I speak?" Permission granted. Hilda looked around at her fellow prisoners, seeing her own fear and hope reflected in familiar faces. Edeltraud gave her an encouraging nod. Sieglinde reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. "We have been talking among ourselves," Hilda began, her accented English clear but trembling slightly. "Some of us, we do not wish to return to Germany immediately. We would like to request permission to remain in America." The words fell into stunned silence. Captain Sutherland's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing genuine surprise. Several American guards exchanged confused glances. This was unprecedented. Prisoners of war did not request to stay in captivity. Edeltraud stood next, followed by Gertrude, Sieglinde, and 4 other women, 8 in total, standing together in a show of unified purpose. Captain Sutherland found her voice. "I need you to understand what you are asking. You are enemy nationals, prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention provides for your repatriation, not for extended residence." Hilda had prepared for this objection. "Captain, we understand the legal complications, but we are asking you to consider our situation with compassion. Germany is destroyed. Many of us have no families to return to. Those who do have families cannot help them. We would return to starvation and rubble." Here, she gestured around the room, We have found something we cannot name properly in English, but something important. We have learned what it means to be treated with dignity. We have been shown kindness by people who should be our enemies. News of the German women's unprecedented request spread beyond Camp Swift with remarkable speed. A reporter from the Bastrop Advertiser had somehow learned of the situation and published a story that was quickly picked up by larger papers in Austin and Houston. Within days, the story had reached newspapers in Dallas, San Antonio, and eventually the national wire services. The headlines varied depending on editorial perspective. Some papers ran sympathetic stories, emphasizing the women's transformation and genuine remorse. Others published outraged editorials, questioning why Nazi prisoners should receive special treatment when American soldiers were still fighting and dying in the Pacific Theater. The debate became a flashpoint for larger questions about justice, forgiveness, and America's role in post-war reconstruction. In Bastrop and the surrounding communities, the response was similarly divided. Many residents had never given much thought to the prisoner of war camp on the outskirts of their town. Now they were forced to consider what it meant to show mercy to former enemies. Pastor William Hendricks of First Baptist Church spoke from his pulpit about Christian forgiveness and the parable of the Good Samaritan. "These women are asking us to live our stated values," he told his congregation. "They are asking if our faith is real or merely convenient." His words inspired some congregants and angered others. Several families walked out during the sermon. Local businessman Harold Thornton wrote an angry letter to the newspaper, arguing that Germans had started the war and should face the consequences without seeking special favors from their victims. His son had died at Normandy, and the thought of German women receiving compassion while his boy lay in a foreign grave felt like betrayal. But Sarah Mitchell, a local teacher unrelated to Captain Sutherland, organized a petition supporting the women's request. She gathered signatures from neighbors who had met the prisoners through church outreach programs and witnessed their genuine transformation. "These are not hardened Nazis," her petition argued. "They are young women who were misled by propaganda and now seek a chance to build better lives." The petition gathered over 200 signatures, impressive for a small Texas community. Mrs. Patterson found herself at the center of unwanted attention. Reporters called asking for interviews. Some townspeople stopped her at the grocery store to express support. Others confronted her with accusations of being soft on enemies. She maintained her characteristic calm through all of it, simply stating that she had taught cooking to some prisoners and found them to be good students and decent people. The debate reached the Texas State House, where representatives argued about the legal and moral implications of allowing enemy prisoners to remain on American soil. Some saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate American values of redemption and second chances. Others viewed it as dangerous precedent that could encourage other prisoners to seek similar treatment. Meanwhile, in Washington, military officials and State Department bureaucrats wrestled with unexpected complications. The Geneva Convention clearly outlined procedures for repatriation of prisoners of war, but it had not anticipated prisoners who actively refused freedom in their own countries. The bureaucratic debate in Washington eventually produced an unexpected compromise. While the War Department would not prevent repatriation of any prisoner who wished to return immediately, those who chose to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. It was not a guarantee of permanent residence, but it opened a path forward. The decision came with significant conditions. The women would no longer be prisoners of war, which meant they would no longer be guaranteed housing and support at Camp Swift. They would need sponsors willing to provide housing and help them find employment. They would need to demonstrate ability to support themselves. And they would face extensive background checks and interviews to ensure they posed no security risk. Captain Sutherland delivered this news to the 8 women who had requested to stay with mixed emotions. She had grown to respect these prisoners, had witnessed their genuine transformation, but she worried about the challenges they would face as former enemies trying to integrate into American society. The sponsorship requirement seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. Who would voluntarily take responsibility for a former Nazi Auxiliary Corps member? But the response surprised everyone. Mrs. Enid Patterson immediately offered to sponsor Hilda, providing housing in her modest home and promising to help her find work as a translator or cook. "I have watched this girl grow over these months," she told Captain Sutherland firmly. "She has a good heart and a strong work ethic. She deserves a chance." The camp medical officer, Dr. Raymond Hughes, offered to sponsor Gertrude and help her pursue nursing certification. Her medical knowledge and compassionate nature would make her an excellent nurse, he argued. Local families who had participated in church outreach programs stepped forward to sponsor Edeltraud and Sieglinde. The Caldwell family, who owned a bakery in Bastrop, saw opportunity in Edeltraud's organizational skills and offered her both sponsorship and employment. The Morrison family, whose son was serving in the Pacific, offered to sponsor Sieglinde, moved by her youth and obvious vulnerability. Within 2 weeks, all 8 women had secured sponsors. The speed and generosity of the response spoke to something deep in the local community's character. These were people who took their faith seriously, who believed in redemption, and who were willing to back those beliefs with concrete action. The transition from prisoner to displaced person occurred on July 1st. The women moved out of the camp barracks and into their sponsors' homes. For Hilda, this meant a small bedroom in Mrs. Patterson's farmhouse, surrounded by recipes, books, and the smell of baking bread. The first morning in her new home, Hilda woke disoriented. No morning assembly, no guards, no barracks full of other women, just sunlight through gingham curtains and the sound of Mrs. Patterson moving around in the kitchen below. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Mrs. Patterson preparing breakfast. "Good morning, honey," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "I hope you slept well. Today we are going to bake depression cake together, just you and me. Then we will take it to the church social so folks can meet you proper." The years between 1945 and 1950 were marked by gradual transformation as the 8 German women built new lives from borrowed recipes and second chances. Hilda's integration into Bastrop society was slow but steady. Mrs. Patterson's sponsorship provided not just housing, but entry into a community network of church ladies, garden clubs, and civic organizations. Initially, many women were suspicious of having a former enemy in their midst. Some refused to speak to Hilda at social gatherings. Others offered cold politeness while maintaining careful distance. But Mrs. Patterson was a respected figure in the community, and her unwavering support for Hilda carried weight. More importantly, Hilda proved herself through consistent action rather than words. She volunteered at church functions, always arriving early and staying late to help with setup and cleanup. She shared her knowledge of German cooking, teaching neighbors to make strudel and traditional breads. And she became known for her depression cake, which she baked for every community gathering. Each time someone complimented the cake, she would explain its origin. "This is what Mrs. Patterson taught me," she would say in her accented English. "This is American resourcefulness. This is how you make something sweet, even in hard times." The story of the depression cake became her introduction, her explanation, her bridge between 2 identities. By 1948, Hilda had saved enough money from cooking jobs to open a small bakery in downtown Bastrop. She called it the Second Chance Bakery, a name that made some people uncomfortable but accurately reflected her story. The bakery specialized in both German and American baked goods, but the depression cake remained her signature item. Edeltraud found her calling in the Caldwell family bakery, where her organizational skills revolutionized their business operations. She introduced German precision to American abundance, creating systems for inventory management and production scheduling that increased both efficiency and profits. By 1950, the Caldwells had made her a partner in the business. Gertrude completed her nursing certification and began working at Bastrop County Hospital. Her careful attention to patients and her gentle manner made her beloved among both staff and those she cared for. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to healing as a form of ongoing atonement for her country's actions. Sieglinde, the youngest of the group, integrated most completely into American life. She married a local farmer's son in 1949, taking his name and building a family that represented the complete fusion of German heritage with American identity. Her children would grow up knowing their mother's story, but thinking of themselves as fully American. The four women maintained close friendships, gathering regularly to speak German, cook traditional foods, and support each other through the ongoing challenges of building lives in a country that had been their enemy. They also maintained correspondence with the women who had chosen repatriation, creating a network that spanned the Atlantic and represented different choices made from the same impossible situation. September 12, 1970. Hilda Richter Patterson stood in the kitchen of her successful Bastrop bakery, preparing depression cakes for a German-American cultural exchange event in Austin. At 49 years old, she had become a naturalized American citizen, built a thriving business, and earned genuine respect in her adopted community. She had taken Mrs. Patterson's surname after her sponsor's death in 1962, honoring the woman who had given her a second chance. The cultural exchange had invited her to speak about her experiences as a former prisoner of war who chose to remain in America. Event organizers wanted her to bring examples of the American cooking that had influenced her journey. She had chosen to bring depression cake, of course. Nothing else could properly tell her story. The event hall in Austin was filled with German immigrants, German Americans, and local residents interested in cultural exchange. Hilda stood before them, holding a simple chocolate cake on a plain white platter. In her other hand, she carried something else. The small notebook where she had recorded recipes during her time at Camp Swift, its pages stained and worn from 25 years of use. She began speaking in English, her accent still noticeable but her vocabulary fluent and precise. She told them about arriving at Camp Swift, expecting cruelty and finding abundance. About learning to bake in Mrs. Patterson's kitchen while her family starved in Germany. About the moment she tasted depression cake and realized that everything she had been taught about American weakness was a lie. "This cake," she said, holding up the platter, "represents the moment I understood that poverty is not the same as weakness and abundance is not the same as decadence." Americans had suffered during the Depression, truly suffered. But they responded by becoming more resourceful, more creative, more generous. They learned to make something sweet with basic ingredients. They learned to celebrate even in hard times. She explained how the depression cake had become her bridge between two identities, how it represented both American resourcefulness and the possibility of transformation. How each time she baked it, she remembered Mrs. Patterson's kindness and the choice she had made to stay. In the audience, Edeltraud, Gertrude, and Sieglinde sat together, 3 of the original 8 who had made that impossible choice 25 years earlier. The other 4 had built successful lives scattered across Texas, all of them present in spirit if not in person. Hilda concluded her speech by cutting the cake and inviting everyone to taste it. As people came forward, she explained the recipe to anyone who asked, emphasizing its simplicity and the lesson it taught. "You do not need fancy ingredients to make something good," she told them. "You need knowledge, resourcefulness, and the willingness to create sweetness, even in difficult circumstances." An elderly German immigrant approached her afterward, tears in his eyes. "I came to America in 1948, he said in German. "I also found kindness where I expected hatred. Your story gives me words for my own experience." Hilda embraced him, understanding exactly what he meant. Their journeys had been different, but the destination was the same, a discovered home in a country that valued second chances